Welcome to the Home Bar Beginner with me, Vic Vinegar, and today we're talking about alcohol. I'm just kidding, we're always talking about alcohol. Today we're going to be talking about spirits. What is a spirit, you might be asking? Well, a spirit is anything distilled to over 20% alcohol by volume. It has to be distilled, as I just mentioned. It also can't have any sugar added to it after the fact. So you might also know that as hard liquor, or you may have just been calling that liquor, period, as kind of a colloquial for what is actually a spirit. So the other things that spirits achieve is they have a higher alcohol by volume or proof, which is just doubling the ABV. So like I said, it's got to be at least 20%. So a lot of spirits are around 40%. Spirits are much higher proof than your fermented alcohols. So spirits, by going through the distilling process, they achieve a rendering that's much higher in alcohol versus something like a wine or a beer, or even the malt liquor, as they call it, that they put in something like Mike's Hard Lemonade or a Smirnoff Ice, or most seltzers call for a malt liquor, or they call it something like that, or they'll call it flavored beer, but it's really malt liquor in there. What those are all fermented. They are not distilled. Now there are distilled products made from fermented products, as in we'll talk about today. You can distill wine and you end up getting brandy. So that does exist, but the overlap ends there. So I'm also going to be talking a little faster today in this video because there's a lot to cover. So if you're struggling to keep up with everything I'm saying, or you're struggling to pick up on a Midwestern accent, just go ahead and play it at a slower speed. YouTube should give you that option. So that's what I'd recommend. But why do I have so much to cover today? Well, that's because there is a lot to do with spirits. Now, say you're a young adult, or you just got out of college, or anything in between. Maybe you never really got into spirits and liquor like this before. Maybe you've never made yourself a cocktail. There is a ton to spirits you might not already know. And if you already do know a thing or two about spirits, go ahead and watch through the rest of the video. Comment anything I missed or anything I might have said incorrectly, which I hope I don't. I'm going to try and keep this as truthful and clear as possible. So today we're going to be diving into the 5 major families of spirits that go into most of your cocktails. We're also going to cover a couple others that you might not immediately associate with cocktails, or you may never have heard of today. So like I said, if you are somebody who knows a thing or two about spirits already, you might actually still pick up something new today, because towards the end of the video, I'm going to be covering some of the things that are not as readily known, at least in the United States. I'm also going to break up the video. You should be seeing little tabs along the bottom of your screen, so you can jump to certain spirits if you'd like to. I really encourage you to watch the whole video so you actually learn a thing or two if you are already familiar with certain segments. But if you do want to just brush up on one, or rewatch this and just want to cover a specific spirit, please feel free to do that. Or if you're just trying to show a friend something, I'd be honored. So the reason you may not have already exposed yourself or been exposed to all these different spirits that are out there is that they could be price prohibitive, they could be hard to find, or somebody may have never told you about them. So the last piece there is what I'm trying to fill in for you. And the first piece about being cost prohibitive, I'd really like to try and break some of the some of the misconceptions about that. Good alcohol does not have to cost you a ton. Granted, there are tons of great alcohols that cost a lot of money, but there are quite a few budget brands that get the job done and or are fantastic and compete with much higher brands. So I'll try and point out a few of those today. This isn't going to be like a shopping list video, so you're not going to necessarily have 18 brands at the end of the day to go out and buy. I don't want you to do that anyway. I definitely encourage you to get into these slowly, pick up a few at a time, and try out what you like, see what you'd like to play around with. And I'll also drop some recommended cocktails with each of the spirits I covered today, so that if you are picking one up, you have a drink you can make pretty much right off the top of the list that you can already do. 2 other notes I want to include before kicking off today. I'm going to do a separate video on how spirits are actually produced, and really liquor and alcohol as a whole. I probably won't talk about fermented alcohols very much. This isn't as much a beer and wine channel as it is going to be focused on cocktails, which are primarily based in spirits. But I will be doing a whole video on distilling. It won't be super in-depth, that's not the point. I'm not going to get into the molecular science of all this, nor am I an expert on the distilling process. So I will pass along what I know, and it should be kind of a high-level, digestible, fairly easy to wrap your head around bit of information that'll probably take a fairly long time to get through nonetheless. Part of that comes with the process of a lot of these spirits is aging. So I'm going to be referencing aging today. I'm probably also going to be referencing a number of other distilling terms. So go ahead and see that video in the future. Like I said, I'll be mentioning aging stuff. That'll be more clear in that follow-up video. But if you do have burning questions, just go ahead and leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them to the best of my knowledge or direct you to a resource that would be even better for that. The last thing I want to mention before jumping into our first spirit are what are known as appellations of origin. So appellations of origin are legal designations given to specific products. This isn't just an alcohol term, this applies to different foods. It's really a culinary term as a whole. But what the appellations of origin do, they are granted typically by a governing body. So there is one body that oversees all of the appellations of origin, but they're typically granted by individual countries for a specific product to be produced in a specific way, in a specific place. I'll get into more specifics about the appellations of origin once I get to the specific products we'll be talking about today. But I think the most famous, arguably just outright, but the most famous that you'd probably know off the top of your head would be champagne. How a sparkling wine can be made anywhere in the world, but it's only champagne if it comes from the Champagne region of France and is made there. So that covers basically what an appellation of origin is at a high level. And one final note is that I really want to try and expand your mind a little on some of these things. Some of these things you may have preconceived notions of what, say, vodka tastes like, or you may have had a bad experience with a certain spirit or a certain drink. I totally get that there might be that one brand of flavored vodka that you will never drink again because of some bad experience at a party in college. Yeah, that happens, but it doesn't need to ruin the rest of vodka, especially as you move up into higher tiers. I'm willing to bet that wasn't Grey Goose you got sick on. It's probably something more like a flavored Smirnoff. I'm not going to be dumping on Smirnoff the whole video, but it is a cheap vodka and that does happen. So the first spirit we're going to be getting into today is rum. Rum might be the first thing you think of when you think of, well, what did pirates drink back in the day? But it is a far more versatile liquor than you might be giving it credit. It also kind of gets stereotyped into specific tropical drinks. Like a pina colada is amazing. There's nothing wrong with pina colada, but it often does tend to represent what rum goes in. That's not fair at all. Rum does go in a ton of tiki drinks or tropical drinks, but it goes in a wide variety of them that you may have never heard of. And also it has some of its own standalone drinks that are not super sweet or frozen or include a pineapple wedge in them. People have been distilling rum for quite a long time. So basically as soon as Europeans started planting sugarcane in the Caribbean and Americas in force, that's when you get your first rum distillation. So rum is made from sugarcane. Now there are subtle differences between certain island rums, certain regions, what they do with that sugarcane in between cutting it down and turning it into rum, but the majority turn it into molasses first, so thick gooey stuff that you probably maybe only use in baking anymore. Don't see a whole lot of it, but it's that brown sugary, really thick, and what that is that's all the sugars broken down already. Then they go and distill that. They put it in the still and magic happens. I'll cover that in the other video, but that does explain why rum is one of the highest alcohols in sugar content. So if you're trying to diet, rum is not the one to go to, but it does carry more of that sweetness with it versus something like a vodka, which is very crisp and dry. The first rum we're going to be talking about today is the oldest, and I'll be popping bottles up here when I don't have them sitting in front of me, so you'll see that. So the bottle I'm displaying right now is Gosling's. Gosling's is an old rum, I believe 18 something, it definitely says on the bottle, and I'll try and include that right down here. But the same family has owned the company for a really long time. It's a bit of an abnormal rum because it is aged longer. Once again, I'll talk about aging in full in a separate video, but suffice to say it is aged longer than the typical dark rum. So dark rums have been around the longest. That's not necessarily because of how they're made so much as how they were stored. So when they were stored on ships, when they were transported, it was just easiest to put them in a barrel. That's what they had on hand. So aging naturally took place in that barrel, and they pick up the color from the barrel. It's not like the brown from the molasses comes through or anything. It's literally that it just sits in the barrel. That's what makes it brown. There are a number of rums aged today that only age for around 2 months, and that's not a very long time, but that's enough to impart the character of the barrel. So it picks up the traditional notes that whiskey's associated with, like cinnamon, vanilla, sometimes clove. It's just a little sweeter all around, kind of a caramel color. Given that they're not aged as long, they don't pick up as much of the color in that time, especially because they typically use aged barrels as is. So some of that color's already been soaked up. So some of them add a little bit of caramel coloring in there. It doesn't change the taste at all. It just makes it look darker and richer. Dark rum also has a more full body than what you would say about white rum, which I'll cover in a minute. That means that it literally just is a little more viscous. Once again, that's not the molasses coming through, that's the character of the wood itself being imparted onto the spirit. Specific to this Gosling's rum that's sitting up here, there is a drink that is made specifically with that rum that's called the Dark and Stormy. So if you're familiar with like a Moscow Mule or a gin buck, there's this broad family that are called mules or bucks. Buck is the formal term for that family, that are really a combination of ginger beer and base spirit. So that could be pretty much anything. But if you use Gosling's Black Seal rum with Gosling's ginger beer, you get a Dark and Stormy. So that is a proprietary drink that family, the Gosling family, actually owns the name to that drink. If you make it with any other ginger beer or any other dark rum, you end up with, I believe it's called the Safe Harbor. So you can make a Safe Harbor with anything. You can only make a Dark and Stormy with those two specific ingredients. A spin-off of dark rum that you're probably familiar with is spiced rum. So the spiced rum you're probably most familiar with or might pop in your head first is Captain Morgan. So Captain Morgan is synonymous with spiced rum. Not a ton of drinks call for spiced rum, if I'm being honest, but pretty much anything that calls for a dark rum can be switched out for a spiced rum if you want those notes of your cinnamon, your clove, all those spices you traditionally associate with Captain Morgan or anything else, any other brands. That being said, Captain and Coke is a really common one, or Captain and Ginger Ale is really good as well. Anything that'll, especially anything effervescent that's sparkling like that will kind of get those spice notes up to your nose, those are always good. And anything that'll kind of cover a bit of the harshness of, like specifically Captain, that does well. So a little bit of sugar to cover that, and then you get that spice, which is really nice. You don't necessarily need a bartender to make you one of those. That doesn't take a ton of practice. That's just measuring out a bit of Captain, a little bit of Coke or whatever. But it is a surprisingly delicious drink, so you can still go ahead and impress friends with that or order that at the bar. The last type of dark rum I'm specifically going to talk about today is Jamaican rum. So I'm popping Myers up right here. Myers is the most commonly found in the United States. Most islands and a lot of Central American nations have their own specific types of rum. That's just across the board. That's not unique to dark rum, but you do see there are many specific dark rums as well. So Jamaican's not unique in that it comes from a specific place and gets its own title, but it has a very unique flavor that has given it its own sort of notoriety or fan club. So it carries with it what they call a funk. So as soon as you kind of smell the top of it, you can tell what they're talking about. There's a different way that they ferment some of the sugarcane or processing of the sugarcane that gives it a distinct, they call it a Jamaican rum funk. So it is called for in specific drinks. For example, a Mai Tai, which is a very popular tropical drink, calls for at least a splash of Jamaican rum over the top, if not using Jamaican rum throughout to give it the body of the drink. That's dark rum in a nutshell. So moving forward, we're going to talk about white rum, which I've got sitting right here. You might actually be more accustomed to seeing this than you are to seeing dark rum. So that being because white rum goes in more cocktails. That being said, you usually would sip a nice dark rum over ice or just neat. You probably wouldn't do that with white rum. I'm sure there are plenty of nice white rums that people do that with, or Bacardi Mixer Limon, which is really, it's lemon rum. That's pretty good if you freeze that down and put it over ice. But the white rum goes in quite a few more drinks than the dark rum. So I've got sitting in front of me is Bacardi. That's probably not an unfamiliar name. You probably recognize the label, the bat, everything about it. You might not know a ton about it. They actually have a really fascinating backstory that I don't have time to dig all the way into, but Facundo Bacardi started the company in 1862 in Cuba, and they have been instrumental in inspiring cocktails and really everything about rum ever since. Facundo Bacardi was one of the first to really proliferate white rum. So white rum isn't aged like dark rum is. Sometimes it is aged, but it's typically in either glass or stainless steel, so it doesn't pick up the coloring. The flavor doesn't change a whole lot. Really all that does is it mellows out the alcohol just a little bit. Two of the oldest rum cocktails that are still two of the most popular, the Cuba Libre, which is it's rum, coke, and lime for most intensive purposes and in most cases, and the daiquiri. And I'm not saying like a strawberry daiquiri, the frozen concoction that you get. A proper daiquiri served in a martini glass. It's lime and rum and not a whole lot else. So it's a pretty strong drink, but it is very famous. Both of those cocktails come about after Cuba achieved its independence from Spain, so the Cuban War of Independence. Later on, the next big conflict, the Cuban Revolution with the takeover of Fidel Castro, it forced the family to move the company outside of Cuba. So they had to leave their homeland. They moved headquarters to Bermuda. Quite a bit of production moved to Puerto Rico, where a large amount of the rum is still made, including this one right here. And they moved a considerable amount of their operation to Florida. There are a laundry list of other rum cocktails I could rattle off, but that's probably for another time or place. And also I've got to leave a little bit of suspense on this channel, so I can't be giving everything away right off the bat. But we're not quite done with rum. So a number of rums are flavored. Now, in the very beginning when I was talking about what a spirit is, traditionally speaking, a spirit does not have any sugar added, and most often it doesn't have flavor added. Now, flavored rums, and I'll talk later about flavored vodkas, are kind of the exception to that. So something like a coconut rum, which is probably the most popular type of flavored rum. This one here is Parrot Bay. That's one of the more popular brands of the popular flavored rum. It goes in a lot. So there are a number of drinks, not necessarily old-timey drinks, but quite a few kind of modern classics, or really anything that a white rum would call for that you want a little hint of coconut in, you can splash some of this in there. Some of the other really popular flavors would be your limon Bacardi, and lime is another popular one, because those just very naturally go in a lot of the other drinks that they're associated with. I'll also plug a number of other Bacardis up here that are pretty wild in flavor. So, and by wild, I don't mean like they taste nasty or anything. It's just like I wouldn't immediately think of passion fruit on my top 5 list of fruits I eat every day. These can go in pretty much anything that you're already putting white rum in, so long as you like that associated flavor. That's a good way to kind of doctor up drinks to make them your own. If your guest asks, wow, I've had a rum and coke before, but this is different, it's fantastic. Well, maybe you put a little bit of lime in there, a little bit of coconut, and that's the thing that makes it your signature. The other drink that calls for coconut rum that is fantastic, and I will probably do on this channel eventually, is called Electric Beach Water. That's credited to, or rather at least I got it from Tipsy Bartender. So you can look up their recipe there. I use straight Hypnotic in that. That's a total aside, but if you look it up, you'll see what I mean. I don't use any of the blue raspberry. Second on our list today is going to be vodka. So vodka is absolutely massive in scope, and not necessarily in all the different flavors of vodka, which there are a ton I'll talk about, but in the sales. So vodka sells more than all of the dark liquors combined. And so that doesn't include rum or white rum or gin or any other clear liquor. It just dominates US sales. It really does. You can credit quite a bit of that proliferation to the original Mr. Smirnoff, who started his distillery, switched the spelling from the V at the end of his name to 2 F's, and that's how you end up with Smirnoff. And they took off, but they didn't take off immediately. So he started it in the late 1800s. So somewhere around 1876, I believe he started selling in Philadelphia, a bit later in Chicago. But vodka didn't really hit the market in mass until the end of Prohibition and really into the 1940s and 50s. So a lot of this comes about with kind of the hippie generation and a lot of young people that didn't want to drink their parents' whiskey straight, or a lot of these older classic cocktails that have since come back into fashion, but at the time they were just kind of old. It was kind of the same thing about how like Ford advertised the Mustang, like you don't want to drive what your parents drive. I think that's a pretty common trend through pretty much all of human history. So that's where vodka comes on the scene. It also has to do a decent amount with women actually having more say in what they wanted to drink. So a lot of bars had these kind of like foo-foo, they were supposed to be female drinks. They had a lot of cream, a lot of sugar, and frankly, it was just kind of insulting. So at the same time, this like straight whiskey or scotch was really advertised at men, and at that, like older, rougher men and all this and that. So with vodka coming on the scene and like everybody being interested in what is this vodka thing, women were really able to get a say in a lot of the creation of these vodka cocktails. That is not to say that vodka is overtly feminine by any means. What it is that it coincided with women finally getting a choice in what they wanted to drink, and that's awesome. So that's how it made its way to the US, but vodka is much older. It historically comes from Eastern Europe. Both Poland and Russia lay claim to its founding, and both today still make and consume a ton of it. Also a lot of Scandinavia and really a lot of the former Soviet Union, a lot of Eastern Europe has been making their own form of vodka for a very long time. And you might immediately think of Russian vodka as being distilled from potatoes as it was back in the day. There definitely are still plenty of potato-based vodkas, but vodka by its very nature can be distilled from just about anything that is distillable, I should say. So vodka can be distilled from pretty much anything. So a lot of it now is distilled from grains, so that's similar to like whiskey or anything else. It's more about how it's processed, and once again in the full distilling video I'll cover more of that, but basically vodka is distilled down to be as pure a spirit as possible, meaning it's really just alcohol with water to some degree. There's still some flavor character that comes through. Some people say that vodka has a nuttiness to it, but really it is supposed to be a tasteless liquor. And that's what it was marketed as, and that's what it's still marketed as. So a proper, just plain vodka, especially an Eastern European vodka, more traditional, like Sobieski, which is a Polish vodka, is going to try and be as tasteless as possible. That's what they're really going for. So if you take a sip of that, you shouldn't be getting too much taste. Now, the flavored stuff, which I'll pop up a couple right here, like New Amsterdam makes a whole bunch of different flavored ones that are different fruits and maybe vanilla, and then Svedka makes some more out there flavors, I guess we'll call them. Those you're intended to taste, obviously. I don't know if the point is to try and mask the flavor of the alcohol, because it doesn't really do that. If you've ever tried one of those, you know. But it does add a specific note to whatever drink you're mixing it with. Your traditional vodka, though, like I've got sitting right here, is intended to go in some specific drinks. And by some specific drinks, I mean there are a ton of vodka drinks. From the 40s on out, new generations have come up with all sorts of different ways to use vodka. Two of the most popular that you probably know would be like a Cosmopolitan or Cosmo. A Moscow Mule is super popular as well. It's a pretty easy one to drink. But also the vodka martini really kind of took over from the gin martini, which is still my preferred, but it has taken over in large regard. And a vodka martini, if somebody orders it dry or extra dry, they're really just drinking very cold vodka. Like, pretty much. That's pretty much all that is. So people do love their vodka. It's not just some Soviet stereotype or something. There are real vodka fanatics and people who are very passionate about it, and people who can really tell the taste between the different brands. Taste isn't necessarily what is supposed to differentiate the brands. What you get when you buy nicer bottles of vodka are different levels of smoothness. So something like Sobieski is a cheap vodka. It is. I think I got it for around 12 bucks. Now it hits above its price, which is why I bought it. If you look up some of its ratings and whatnot, it scores alongside much more expensive bottles. Another pretty inexpensive brand would be something like Sky, or Tito's is another one that's really good. The Sky and Tito's are both being American brands actually, and they hit above their price point, meaning they are pretty smooth. Now, something like Smirnoff can be very cheap, and it's not a bad vodka by any means. There are bad vodkas that I'll put up there. Smirnoff's not necessarily one of those, but it is one of your cheaper ones, so it's going to be a little rougher, burn a little more going down versus some of your smoother blends. Something like Grey Goose, which I already mentioned once, or even a nicer Polish vodka would be something like Belvedere. So all of those are going to be much smoother. If you're drinking a vodka martini, really make sure you're doing something like that. If you're just making a screwdriver or trying to add a little more kick to a drink by sneaking in some vodka behind it, go ahead and use whatever the heck you want. Now I'm going to talk about one more clear spirit before getting into a couple of the darks, and that's going to be gin. So I'm going to switch out my vodka and pull over gin. Now I already mentioned that I personally prefer a gin martini, which is a classic martini, to a vodka martini. That was martini many times in a row. Anyway, I have a special sweet spot for gin and I used to hate it. So this is me encouraging you to expand your palate. Now, it's not for everyone, and you may already know why. If you give this stuff a whiff, grass clippings. Now, I'm not saying it actually smells like a lawnmower, but that's what a lot of people think when they first smell it. It's got that grassy, very herbal note to it. And that's intentional. That is what they call botanicals. Botanicals are worked into the spirit itself, and that's what gives gin its specific character versus vodka. So as they come out of the still, vodka and gin are very similar in that vodka can really be distilled from pretty much any distillable thing. So can gin. Gin doesn't have a whole lot of rules in regards to what it can be made from. But what makes it special is that gin is redistilled using different components. So the initial tasteless spirit is made, which is, for most intents and purposes, very similar to vodka, just not as filtered, and then it's redistilled with its botanicals. And the key botanical that makes gin so special, and it is actually the root of its name, even though in English it doesn't quite add up, is the juniper berry. If you're thinking of the thing that kind of looks like a cedar tree, kind of a pine tree looking thing, that's juniper. So it's pretty much the only time you regularly consume something that comes from a pine tree, aside from maybe like pine nuts. So I guess that'd be kind of a fun Jeopardy fact or something. Now, I pointed out that I kind of came around to gin for a specific reason. If you just smell it, like I said, it's initially a little off-putting. You don't really get how that's going to taste good and how it's going to work into another drink. So you don't hear of like a gin and Coke. That's not a thing because those are flavors that don't really work together. You don't hear about gin with a whole lot of tropical stuff. Like gin and pineapple, like it'd probably be fine, but it's not what it's known for. What you're looking for are things that combine with those botanical notes. So the most famous cocktail period is your classic martini. And what that is it's a nice gin, I recommend a nice gin, and dry vermouth with a little bit of bitters in it. So dry vermouth has kind of the herbal notes as well as the gin. So the two play together very nicely. They combine to give you a surprisingly complex flavor for only 2 ingredients and being absolutely booze through and through. So, I mean, if you're just getting into liquor especially, yeah, don't start with martinis. I mean, they'll burn your throat like nothing else if you haven't like warmed up to it a little bit. But as you start to like diversify your palate, or if you really want to jump in head first on the no diving end, go for it. A much more subtle way to get yourself involved with gin would be to go with something like a gin and tonic. So a gin and tonic is just kind of, it's synonymous with the drink as well. So it really is just, it's simple. It's gin and tonic. The third ingredient's ice, and you don't even have to shake it. You don't need to stir it, nothing. It's that easy. I'm not a huge gin and tonic person, but I can appreciate why they work well together. Tonic has quinine in it, which was actually originally used as an anti-malarial drug. So the gin and tonic is an aftermath of some old-timey apothecary sort of combinations. So they were combining quinine with gin as a way to fight off malaria, and then end up with a gin and tonic down the road. So they proved it worked much earlier than people started drinking them for pleasure, we'll say that much. The final cocktail I mentioned in terms of getting into gin that is probably your single best choice would be a Tom Collins. And a Tom Collins is a tall drink. It's served in a Collins glass, of which the glass is named after. And it's gonna be lemon juice, a little bit of simple syrup, gin, and sparkling water. So I like to use club sodas. Some call for tonic, but I like to leave that quinine flavor out of it when I can. Not my biggest thing. Now, in regards to the Tom Collins, I've had people who vehemently don't like gin ask me to make them a drink. I did not know they didn't like gin. I made them a Tom Collins. They got halfway through the drink and asked, "Does this have gin in it?" I'm like, "Yeah, it has gin in it." They're like, "Oh, I like it. Normally I hate gin." So if that's not enough to convince you, what more could I do? Lastly, I'll talk about the different types of gin. So there's really one very large common strain, and that is London Dry. So London Dry comes about in, I believe, the 1800s-ish, and it was due to advances in distilling. So you won't see any of like the gin they were drinking in the 17th century or 1700s. You're not going to see that on the shelf. It probably just wouldn't pass FDA standards anymore. But so most clear gins are London Dry. They're very crisp. They're very typically juniper forward, meaning you get a lot of that juniper smell and taste, what you would associate with kind of the grassiness. So that's all bottled up in London Dry. So that's typically, that goes in most drinks, just outright, but that's definitely what you would put in your classic martini. Now, there's another variant, which I'll pop up one here, made by the Aviation brand, which is called Old Tom style. And that's been around for a long time too. That's not unique to Aviation. They're much newer than this style of gin. So you can see that the Old Tom has a bit of a yellowed hue to it. So what makes it special is it goes through a little different process in the end. It's a little more mellow. It's got some different flavors to it. It's a little sweeter. So if you are just trying to get into gin, that might be your better transitional sort of spirit to get into, because it is a little softer on you. Now, granted, Old Tom can be much harder to find. So most of your typical grocery store that has a liquor section, or your corner liquor store, might not have it, but if you can, it's fun to play around with for sure. The final type I'll talk about is what I call infused gins. And infused gins aren't really their own category. This is something I'm kind of making up. But they're those that have specific characters that differentiate from a mainline gin. So something like this Jack Pine gin is classic to what flavors you would expect in a gin. An infused gin, you might get something like citrus forward. So you get a little more lemon than you typically would, or maybe a little more lemon than juniper, or maybe it's juniper soft. Or one of the most popular brands, by bars at least, is Hendrick's. I'll pop up a photo right here. I personally really love Hendrick's, but it says right on the bottle it's not for everyone. That being because it's infused with cucumber and rose water in the distilling process. So you get kind of an extra dose of that herbal, vegetal sort of taste. Now, it works very well in a classic martini, but they also specifically advertise making like a cucumber cooler with it, or maybe a basil cooler. So those might sound a little funky to you right now, but as you start to expand kind of your mind around gin and around the rest of your clear liquors, I think they'll start to make a little more sense, and I think you'll actually really enjoy it. All right, so now we're going to transition to a dark spirit, and we're going to talk probably the most at length about this next one, because it has an absolutely fanatical following, especially in the United States, but really around the globe. And that is, drum roll, whiskey. So a lot of countries and nations and cultures have their own specific spirits. A lot of them have their own specific vodka too. Maybe they have their own rum. Maybe they have their own type of gin. But the countries that have their own whiskey are typically the most fanatical about it. And guess what? The United States has two specific types of whiskey that can only be produced within its borders. So we get to be extra fanatical about it. And I'm gonna preface all this, I'm gonna scratch the surface on whiskey. And that goes the same for the distilling video that I do. To get into whiskey in full, you're gonna have to sit here on YouTube for another 2, 3, 4 hours, maybe a day, I don't know. So you might have to go to an expert to get a full picture on whiskey, but even then, a lot of experts argue about this. So I'm gonna try and get you some high level information about whiskey, and enough that you can kind of talk the talk with some of your friends, or maybe older folks that know more about whiskey, or your one friend that is just a total whiskey buff. Something I want to talk about before we even start to get into the type of the whiskeys is about aging. And for the 8th time, I'm going to talk about aging in full later, but there's something about aging and labeling with whiskey specifically. So whiskey has what are called age statements, and that's not necessarily unique to whiskey, but they are very big on it. So I will talk in full down the line here about some of the types of age time classifications. But what I want you to know right off the bat is age statements are a big thing with whiskey. They apply to all types of whiskey. An age statement pertains to the youngest whiskey in the bottle. So you might be a little confused by that. What do you mean there's multiple whiskeys in my bottle? Well, a lot of times they are blended to get a specific flavor. I'll talk about blended whiskeys in a minute or two, but the youngest whiskey is the number that goes on the bottle. So typically if you don't see an age statement, that means it's not a very old whiskey and nobody's going to be too persnickety about it. But if you see that it's, say, a 7-year whiskey, That means that the youngest in there is 7, the oldest could be friggin' 20 if that's the case, but you're always going to see that youngest number. The first whiskey we're going to talk about today then is bourbon. And bourbon is one of the broadest categories in the United States. And not necessarily broadest in that there's a whole bunch of different types of bourbon, but really there's a ton of brands and there's just a ton of bourbon consumed in the United States. So bourbon is one of those names that carries quite a bit of confusion with it. Like, how is bourbon different than whiskey? Is whiskey bourbon? Is bourbon whiskey? Huh? First and foremost, bourbon has to be produced in the United States. That is key to the legal designation of bourbon. Most important to the taste, though, is that it has to be 51% corn. It has to be at least 51% corn, I should say. So you have some like Maker's Mark, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, that use something like 80% corn, whereas some will dial it all the way back, and then the other 49% can be other grains like rye or barley or any of these other things. So that's critical to kind of understanding. What they call it is the mash bill. Being like 51% corn is 51% of the mash bill is corn. That's kind of a technical term that's really just representative of typically the grains that are going into the whiskey to be distilled. There are other specific rules with bourbon. It can't be distilled to any more than 160 proof. It can't enter the barrel at any more than 125 proof, and it can't be bottled at anything less than 80 proof. So 40% ABV. So your typical range for bourbon is between about 80 proof and typically around 100 proof. There are overproofed bourbons. They're not nearly as common, or just they're usually not as drinkable. The final component to making bourbon is that it has to be aged in new charred American oak barrels. So a lot of different brown or dark spirits can be aged in used barrels. I talked earlier about how dark rum is typically aged in already used barrels, so some of that color is already seeped out. That's how you get a lot of your darker colors in whiskey, is that they are brand new barrels and they're charred, so that char color gets in there as well as the color of the actual oak. So those are the rules that govern bourbon and that make it specifically bourbon. Now there's also 2 strains of bourbon itself. So the first I'm going to talk about is Kentucky. And Kentucky bourbon makes up 95% of the bourbon sold in the United States. So really we could say that it's 95% of the bourbon in the world is Kentucky whiskey. One of the biggest Kentucky whiskey brands that you might know is Maker's Mark, which I've got up here. You recognize it by the wax covered handle. So it is a classic Kentucky whiskey. Really the only thing that differentiates it from any other bourbon made in the country is that it's made in Kentucky, and they use specific streams and rivers as their water source that they at least claim gives it its specific taste. Kentucky also lends itself to one of the hypothesized origins of the name bourbon. So there's a county in Kentucky that is Bourbon County, and it's believed that the spirit is named after that as it flowed down the river down towards the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico. When it was consumed by well-to-do people in, say, New Orleans, they referred to it by the county that it originated from, which they kept calling Bourbon. So that's one idea. They also say it might be linked with the name of the French royalty at the time. There's no real clear definition. All we do know is that bourbon comes into existence when farmers who had been distilling grain into whiskey for a while at this point in the original 13 colonies start getting taxed. So this leads to the Whiskey Rebellion, which you might remember from history class in middle high school, somewhere around there. They got pretty PO'd. They ended up leaving effectively due to this tax. They said, this is ridiculous, we're going to move west. Well, west at the time was Kentucky and Tennessee, and today you still have Kentucky and Tennessee whiskey, and like I said, the majority of whiskey comes out of Kentucky. The other primary type of bourbon is Tennessee whiskey, and a lot of you probably know that as Jack Daniel's, but there are plenty of other brands as well. And what really differentiates Tennessee whiskey, aside from using Tennessee water versus Kentucky water, is that it's filtered through charcoal. So there are other bourbons out there that go through that same process, but if it's not made in Tennessee, it can't be Tennessee whiskey. But that imparts a bit more smokiness to the spirit itself that you can kind of pick up. It gives it a little bit of a rougher feel in the throat, but it also makes it, I guess, a little more robust, you could say. So it's a bit more of an acquired taste. Kentucky is what most people would think of when they think of bourbon, being that it is a pretty sweet whiskey, it is pretty smooth, whereas Tennessee is just a little different, and that's totally up to personal preference. The other type of whiskey that is largely produced in the United States, but it is not unique to the United States, is rye whiskey. And one of the most popular brands for that is Bulleit Rye. So Bulleit also makes a bourbon, but rye is really what they're known for. So rye whiskey, as to bourbon, uses 51% corn, rye whiskey has to use 51% rye. So it's not as sweet as bourbon, it doesn't have the same sugars as corn does, and it carries with it what you would call a spice note. So it's not like a spiced rum to that degree. So it's got a little bit more spice. That's not to say it's bitter or anything, and it's not to say it's literally like hot spicy, but it just carries a different profile with it. It's just not associated as being as sweet. So something like an old fashioned where you want it to be a pretty sweet drink, you would probably go with a bourbon because you want to keep that sweetness. Now, purists would say that something like a Manhattan, which is another just classic cocktail that is supposed to have a bit more of those spices, a bit more of that complex floral sort of whatever that comes in from the sweet vermouth that you add to it. Once you combine that with the bitters, you end up with what they want to be a little bit spicier of a drink. Now, you can absolutely put bourbon in a Manhattan. It's largely purists that say you should be doing rye, but that is an example of a drink that typically calls for rye over bourbon. All right, now there's a couple designations to get into while we're kind of in the middle of the whiskey section. They don't all specifically apply to bourbon and rye, but a lot of times in the US you do see bottles advertised as such with these monikers. So the first is straight. And straight, which I believe is actually even on this bottle. Yep, Kentucky Straight. So what that means is that it has been aged at least 2 years. So it doesn't typically have an age statement per se because 2 years isn't all that impressive, but the vast majority of typically inexpensive whiskey sold is straight whiskey, so you know it was aged for at least 2 years to pick up those flavors. So the more intense regulations on American whiskey come in the form of bonded whiskey, which is another label that you would see right on here that this one definitely doesn't qualify as. So bonded whiskey means a number of things. The first is that the whiskey comes from one specific distillery, so it's not blended from a bunch of different. It also has to all come from whiskey distilled in one season. So meaning the crop really has to come from one season, and then as it's aged, it stays with its counterparts. So while it's aged, it has to be aged in a federally bonded, hence the name, warehouse. So that means there's just more regulations, there's more oversight, and it means that they are aging in the optimal processes to impart the most flavor. So in these bonded warehouses, the whiskey has to age for at least 4 years, and many bonded whiskeys age for considerably longer than that. And the final component is that they have to be bottled at 100 proof, so 50% alcohol by volume. There's 2 other designations that apply to a wide variety of whiskeys, including those that will come later on this list, and those are single cask and cask strength. So both use that word cask. That's another term for barrel. The barrel is the cask. Cask can also be a specific unit of size for an aging vessel. So a single cask whiskey means that the whiskey in the bottle comes from one specific barrel. So even with some of your bonded whiskeys, they could take whiskey from multiple barrels that were all aged the same and blend them because each one might have a specific character. It might be a little unique. Whereas single cask, you know it is coming from one barrel, for better or for worse. As I mentioned, the other one is cask strength. What that means is that it is bottled directly out of the barrel, whereas single cask means it all comes from one. Cask strength means there's no dilution in between the barrel and the bottle. So previously mentioned with bourbon specifically, it can't enter it typically enters the barrel around 125 proof. Now it loses alcohol as it ages, that is part of the process, but sometimes it doesn't lose that much. So when you're drinking a cask strength whiskey, typically those are your nicest whiskeys because they carry the heaviest flavor with them. But it takes quite a bit to sip one of those straight sometimes, and a lot of times you end up diluting them down, but a lot of purists would say that's just defeating the point, which I kind of agree with because they're usually pretty expensive. All right, so those are a few designations of whiskey. Now I'll actually jump to a different type of whiskey. So I'm going to switch this bottle here out, which was our bourbon. It goes there. I'm going to bring over the Crown Royal, which is a Canadian whiskey, and that is what we're talking about here. So Canadian whiskey is bespoke to its own. It has a number of distinct characteristics, and I'm not making just some dumb Canadian joke when I say that it kind of tastes like maple syrup. It actually does. When you get a whiff of it or a taste, there is supposed to be a bit of maple imparted onto a number of the Canadian whiskeys. So it's typically a little sweeter in nature. It has those vanilla notes, those cinnamon notes, and a bit of what you'd consider like what you associate with maple sugar. So this one here is Crown Royal. Specifically, it's the Crown Royal Vanilla. If you saw the bag that it comes in, which is the classic packaging for Crown, the typical bag for the standard deluxe is purple, whereas the vanilla is this kind of brownish something color. So the vanilla is a little sweeter. It's a great one if you're just getting into whiskey for putting in drinks, for sipping straight. If you want to look sophisticated and sipping whiskey neat and don't want to tell anyone that it's Crown Vanilla, you'll look more complicated or more complex than you are. But yeah, this stuff's really sweet and it's really good. It's still it's 40%, so that's on the low end of what would qualify as a bourbon if it were bourbon. So it's still got plenty of kick to it, but a lot of your expensive stuff, even some of your expensive Canadian blends or brands also, go up to around 50%. The original Crown Royal, which is the deluxe, is what's called a blended whiskey, and that is another stylization of whiskey that applies to a number of different types. So blended just meaning that it comes from a number of distilleries or a number of different stills. So you take barrels from different distilleries or different aging facilities and you blend those all together to achieve the taste you want, because just because you distill in the same way year to year doesn't mean the whiskey tastes the same each time. Even environmental factors can change that. So something like Crown, which has a very distinct taste, wants to be able to maintain that taste. To do that, they balance out their whiskeys by incorporating different types from different distilleries. One final tidbit about Crown specifically was that the blend that is still served up in the deluxe version was supposedly first procured for the Queen and King of England's visit to the nation, and they wanted to present their finest whiskey, and to date that's still supposedly the same flavor that they would have tasted back then. Canadian whiskey itself isn't typically called for in a whole lot of drinks, but it is versatile in replacing a lot of ryes or bourbons. It works pretty well for bourbon because it's often sweeter, but some of your other Canadian whiskeys, even Crown makes a rye version where it's got more of those spice notes that you could work into other drinks. And it works well in a lot of these drinks because that's really what made it popular. So during Prohibition, the U.S. whiskey industry was totally tanked, but our friends up north were still able to distill to their heart's content. So some may have, by less than legal means, made it across the border, especially into towns like Detroit or Buffalo, which were right there. And Canadian whiskey really took off in the U.S. during the years of Prohibition. So another reason Prohibition didn't really work, but it definitely worked in Canada's favor. So the next national specific brand after Canadian whiskey is Irish whiskey, which at one point was the most popular spirit in the world. And then with really the incoming of vodka into the US scene, into a lot of other markets, that really kind of put a curtail on a lot of the Irish whiskey sales, along with all sorts of geopolitical stuff, that was going on at the same time. So it worked its way down to where there were only 4 remaining Irish whiskey distilleries in the nation. So granted, the 4 distilleries that were still in business were all fairly large. We were really running the risk of starting to lose the diversity in the product. But with kind of the craft cocktail movement that has been resurging in the last 10, 20 years, it's really brought a bunch of them back onto the scene. So granted, a whiskey distillery needs to wait for their whiskey to age, so even a few years ago there were still only a couple of distilleries, but really within the last couple of years a number of them have popped up onto the scene. One of the largest brands and probably the most well known in the United States is Jameson. So Jameson might be the first thing you think of for Irish whiskey. Another of the large brands is Bushmills, and some get very expensive, some are more generic, like you would buy generic US bourbon or rye. So they don't have to be expensive, but they certainly can be. And they go in a couple of their own bespoke drinks. A lot of them have their name in it, as in Irish X, Irish something. So it has a flavor profile that is more comparative to US whiskeys than, say, Scotch, which I'll talk about next. So you could work Irish whiskey into most of the drinks that you're used to putting either bourbon or rye in. So there's no reason you really couldn't do like an Irish Manhattan. Irish whiskey is specifically called for in Irish coffee, which is really just Irish whiskey, coffee, and something to sweeten it up. As I mentioned, Scotch is another of those national type of whiskeys that is very near and dear to its inhabitants. So Scotch is its own world unto its own right. So if you really want to get involved or like really engrossed in Scotch, there are plenty of other resources for you there. Much like bourbon enthusiasts in the US, the Scots and their Scotch are very inseparable and they take it very, very seriously. Scotch can get very expensive. It doesn't necessarily have to. Like if you take, for example, a Scotch that you probably know, something like Johnny Walker with the black label, that's not all that expensive. You can find it in just about any liquor store, even quite a few supermarkets. But if you step it up to something like Johnny Walker Blue Label, you're going to be paying a heck of a lot of money to get your hands on a bottle, and you're really going to have to do your research to figure out where you can even buy one. So Scotch runs the full gamut, kind of like I said, Irish whiskey does too. You can buy some really cheap stuff and some really expensive stuff. So that's up to taste and really how far you work your way into it. As with most really expensive spirits, you're going to have to be pretty well initiated with it to really be able to tell between a nice bottle and a superb bottle. So take your time with that. Don't go spending $80 to get your hands on a nice bottle, or let alone like $160, $200, whatever you need to get a hold of a Blue Label Johnny Walker. So part of what drives the price of Scotch is the way that the Scotch is made. And not necessarily the way that it's distilled, but the way that it goes into the bottle. Meaning whether you're blending different Scotches or whether it's coming from one specific source. So a lot of your cheaper Scotches, or more accessible, not that they're any cheaper by taste, are your blended Scotches. So an example of that would be something like Monkey Shoulder, which it's an excellent Scotch that doesn't cost nearly as much as some of the really high-end stuff. So much like blended Canadian whiskey, it works exactly the same. They piece together different Scotches from different barrels or different distilleries, and they're able to really bolster the flavor and achieve the flavor profile that they're looking for. Now, single malt Scotches are where it starts to get really expensive. So some of the specifications to single malt Scotches are that they have to come from one specific grain source. So that's not to say it comes from one field, but rather that all of them have to be made with malted barley only. And the malting process is something I'll get into a little bit in the distilling video, but it's an alteration to the grain and it has to be done to barley. So once you have the malted barley, it has to be cooked up in a pot still versus a column still, another one I'll talk about in the other video, but it has to be done in the older style of distillation, which is a pot still. It has to be performed in one distillery, so that's kind of reminiscent of the bonded whiskey of the US. And then the other major component is that it has to be aged at least 3 years. Now, granted, most Scotches are aged longer than other whiskeys, and some of those single malt Scotches can be aged for a very long time, and they can get very, very expensive with their age. So an example of a single malt Scotch that is fairly well known and is relatively accessible would be Lafroig. So Laphroaig costs around 70 bucks a bottle, so it's a pretty penny to drop, but if you are somebody who is getting very into whiskey or very into Scotch specifically, then it's probably a pretty smart purchase for you. Talking about Laphroaig also gives me the opportunity to talk about peat, and peat is something that makes a lot of Scotches unique from any other type of whiskey. So peat is harvested from the ground, it's cut into blocks, and it is burnt while they malt the barley. So the smoke from the peat itself works its way into the barley, and it continues, that flavor continues through the entirety of the distilling process. So you end up with whiskeys that are called peaty, and Laphroaig is an example of an extremely peaty whiskey. So it's very much an acquired taste. There's some other factors that go into Laphroaig specifically, like where it's produced and distilled. It's produced right along the ocean on the island of Islay, which is one of the designated Scotch regions. They have a number of them you can look up that each produces its own specific style of Scotch whiskey. Most Scotch purists would prefer to drink it neat or on the rocks. They probably wouldn't mix it in with any sort of mixer whatsoever. An example of a drink that does utilize Scotch as its primary ingredient is the Rusty Nail, which is a blend of Scotch and Drambuie, and Drambuie itself is a liqueur that is Scotch based. So it's really sticking close to home, and it's still very much Scotch in every aspect of its roots, but it's a pretty fantastic drink. The Drambuie is a little expensive to get your hands on. If you're buying a nice bottle of Scotch, it could be even more expensive. So it's not necessarily anything you're going to be trying at home in a while, but if you see a bar has a decent Scotch and Drambuie, it might be a neat drink to order. The last specific whiskey I'm going to talk about, and pretty quick, is Japanese whiskey. And if you've noticed the spelling on a couple of these, you might have thought that I missed an E. There are actually two ways to spell whiskey that are both correct. They are associated with specific nations. So Irish and American always keep the E, so they end in EY, whereas Canadian, Japanese, and Scotch all just end in Y. So if you ever get a little confused looking that up, that's why. I don't know that anybody's really going to get on your case about that, but both sides of the coin wonder why the other does it the other way. They're both grammatically correct. Just a few notes though about the Japanese whiskey. Japanese whiskey can be insanely expensive. Like a nice Scotch could easily run you up to 200 bucks. And don't get me wrong, there's Scotches that go way beyond that. But it's not too hard to look up Japanese whiskeys that are almost $700 a bottle. So they put extreme care into the distilling process. Much like the rest of Japanese culture, it's very finesse, it's very specific, very repeatable for the people who are good at it. And even Japanese bartending is very methodical. Make individual drinks for individual customers, it might take 20 minutes. So it's just a very different style of bartending and distilling, but they do crank out some incredible whiskeys. An example of one that is far more accessible would be something that the Suntory brand produces, like Toki, which I'll pop up right here. You can find that in a US liquor store for around 40 bucks. So if you want to at least say you're drinking Japanese whiskey, and a good whiskey at that, then go with something like that. I do not recommend you dropping that much money on something that you can really finish in a couple days if you're ambitious. Now I'm going to jump back from dark liquor to clear liquor, and we're going to talk about tequila. So tequila, I feel, is one of the more misunderstood spirits out there, because I think a lot of people just assume there's basically one tequila and they all taste the same somehow. That couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, they all are going to have a similar profile, but then again, so does whiskey, and there's thousands of whiskey brands. So I think you'd be surprised at the number of tequila brands that exist too. This one here is Sam's Club brand, so it's Members Mark. Not to be confused with Maker's Mark, very different stuff. So this is silver tequila, or Blanco tequila. It is the unaged of the three primary strains of tequila. Blanco tequila is also what most drinks are going to call for. So Like I was saying, there are a number of different types of tequila, a ton of different brands. I think a lot of people just think of Jose Cuervo when they think of tequila. Jose Cuervo is good tequila, don't get me wrong. Cuervo is synonymous with the spirit itself, but there are so many other brands. You've probably heard of Patron, but there's also Hornitos or Jimador, Herradura. There are a ton, and there's a double R in Herradura. I just can't roll my R's well enough, and it'd be too embarrassing to sit here and try. Detouring a bit from talking about the specific types of tequila, I wanted to briefly touch on the appellation of origin that's associated with tequila. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of countries have their own type of rum. A lot of countries have their own vodka they're proud of, or their own specific type of whiskey that they produce, and those might have appellations of origin on them. Can't make Scotch outside of Scotland, can't make Irish whiskey outside of Ireland, can't make Canadian whiskey outside of Canada. Tequila, on the other hand, can only be made in Mexico. So you're not going to go to a distillery in the US, even like a craft distillery, and find a bottle of tequila sitting on the shelf, unless it's an existing Mexican brand they just happen to be carrying for some reason. So most traditionally at that, tequila comes from the state of Jalisco in Mexico, and even more specifically, the town of Tequila. Tequila is produced in those regions because that's where the blue agave grows well. So your nicer tequila, or really most standard tequilas anymore, are 100% blue agave, which, like I said, even this one is pretty cheap Costco brand or Sam's Club brand, and it's 100% blue agave. So some of the really, really cheap stuff, it's partially 100% blue agave, and then they blend that with some sort of neutral grain spirit or whatever, which is basically just really cheap vodka at the end of the day to give you the same effect. Don't buy those, just don't. They don't have the right tequila taste, and you're not getting much for your money with those. All right, so back to the specific types of tequila. So I already mentioned this is Blanco. It goes in the most drinks, or is at least called for in the most drinks. Now, there's probably a few tequila drinks that you already know off the top of your head, like a margarita would definitely pop up either frozen or on the rocks with salt, without, however you want to serve it. There might be a couple others that bounce around your head, but I'm willing to bet the margarita is the one that jumps to the top. Or you might think of like a tequila shooter with lime and salt. There are far more drinks that tequila is actually called for in. An example of one would be a paloma, which is grapefruit juice or grapefruit soda and a bit of lime and tequila. It's really, really simple, and it's really good. The grapefruit and tequila play really nicely together and really kind of mask that harshness that tequila is often associated with, that specific flavor. Whereas Blanco tequila is not aged. It comes right out of the still. Gold or Reposado tequila is aged. So I'll pop an image of one up right here. You might be familiar with that as well, either in the Cuervo brand or something like Hornitos or Jimador, I believe is what I have pictured right here. There are a number of brands that do a Reposado. Now, Reposado has been toned down a little bit, meaning it's aged for a couple months in usually old American oak barrels, which means they were probably used for bourbon. And what that does, the oak, in a similar way to how it kind of dulls down whiskey, which, I mean, really when whiskey comes out of the still, it's moonshine, and then it's mellowed out a bit. Same thing happens with Reposado tequila. So that little bit of aging allows some of the alcohol to dissipate, and then the wood is able to impart its own flavor and mellow out some of those sharper notes. So if you're wanting to take a tequila shot that maybe doesn't hurt as bad, or you'd like to make drinks that have a bit of that sharpness taken off the edge, then you can go with a Reposado. So that's something that you can play around with. Don't get me wrong, it's still got all the tequila kick to it, but it's just a little bit smoother, a little bit more mellow. So you can give that a shot. The final and most expensive type of tequila is Añejo tequila. I'm popping up one here that's produced by Hornitos, and those are your expensive tequilas because they are aged the longest. So whereas a Reposado is aged for months, an Añejo is aged for years. And what that does is it really mellows out all those harsh notes. You really get that input from the wood. It starts to build some more body in a similar way to dark rum does, where it's almost a little more viscous. And that's the whiskey that people sip on ice. And as foreign a concept as that sounds, Añejo tequila is very much like a nice whiskey or a nice dark rum. It is totally both acceptable and encouraged to just sit neat or on ice. It's not necessarily something that you would buy and then mix into a drink. Really, you wouldn't be getting much for your money at that point. You really want to be sipping that, whereas something like a Blanco, and an expensive Blanco, that go ahead and throw in your margarita pitcher and go to town. Now, as I continue this switching back and forth between light and dark liquors, I'm going to transition to brandy. So I'm going to get the tequila out the way and talk about another traditionally kind of misunderstood of these spirits. So a lot of people associate brandy with whiskey, or think that it is a type of whiskey, or at least a cousin. And I guess you could say it's loosely a cousin because the distilling process is fairly similar. Where brandy differs greatly from whiskey is what it's based on, so what is actually distilled. So whiskey is always distilled from grain, whereas brandy is always distilled from wine. It is a grape product, but it is not distilled from grapes themselves. They have to be fermented first, so it's made from fermented grape juice, which you know as wine. Might not be a wine you necessarily drink, but that is what it is made out of. For this reason, it's why you see a lot of your nicest brandies coming out of your most famous wine regions. So you might see a nice brandy coming off the California coast. You might see it at a local winery that you know in your region that you've always wondered, why are they doing brandy and wine? That seems like an unnatural combo. Now that you know what it's made out of, makes a lot of sense. It's also why some of the most prestigious brandy comes out of France, because France is well known for their high-end wines. I already talked about Champagne and its appellation of origin. So its cousin, not the same grapes, but similar deal, is cognac. So cognac is another one that is largely misunderstood because people don't know what the heck it is. So cognac is a brandy. Brandy is not a cognac. Brandy's the family, cognac's the singular. Cognac is associated with being higher end. It's typically more expensive. It's sometimes more robust. Like a very well-known brand would be something like Hennessy, which a lot of people don't even necessarily know is cognac without familiarizing themselves with it. Hennessy kind of has a negative connotation because it's interpreted as being a little more rough. It's definitely not an expensive cognac, whereas your very nice cognacs, there's a reason it's like politicians and nobility that drink the stuff, or at least used to. It's good, it's expensive often, and it is often very smooth. So cognac, it has its own rules and regulations. It does have an appellation of origin, meaning that it can only be produced in France, but also a specific region of France. It can only be produced in the Nouvelle-Aquitaine region of France. Guarantee I pronounced that wrong, hence why I'm putting the text right here, so anybody with better pronunciation can figure out what I actually mean. But it has to come from that region. It has to abide by a number of other rules and regulations, kind of in line with what I already talked about with like bonded whiskey. Similar to how the American government institutes those, the French government has its own standards. There's also a number of industry standards that create a whole bunch of letter acronyms that if you have seen cognac bottles and have been confused by all the acronyms, we're going to dig into a little bit right now. There are a number of different 2-letter, 4-letter, whatever acronyms that can appear on a cognac bottle. They all say something about the age. So similar in line to how a lot of whiskeys use something like straight whiskey or bonded or any number of things, or just an age statement that says, hey, I'm 7 years old. Cognac operates with this letter system. So the first one is VS, which means very special, meaning the youngest cognac in the bottle, if it's blended, there could be multiple, has to be at least 2 years old. Then the next is VO, which is very old. And that's just the next step up from VS, where the youngest cognac in the bottle has to be at least 4 years old. Now, one of the more common acronyms that you'll see on there, not to dilute the quality or anything, but you see it on a lot of the highly promoted cognacs, is VSOP, VSOP. It's very special or superior, depending on your interpretation, old and pale. And what that means is it has the age statement of very old, so it has to be at least 4 years old, and the pale bit is to say that no coloring has been added. So a lot of times with the younger cognacs, to achieve the darker color, they add that caramel coloring, similar to what I talked about they do in dark rum sometimes. The VSOP says that it is not colored, that is exactly as it comes out of the barrel. Some of the nicest stuff that you're gonna see on any given shelf is gonna be an XO, so that's extra old. They got a little cutesy with the X extra, whatever. That's about the nicest you're gonna see on a typical liquor shelf, so that has to be aged at least 10 years. Those can get pretty expensive, and they can also be much older than 10 years. But you start to reach a level at which age starts to kind of get blurred because they're getting so old that the difference between 14 years and 15 years or 20 years and 21 years starts to be less and less unique or less differentiable. So what they call a lot of these, if they're not a vintage, which means they come from a specific year, much like wine is associated with vintages, it's like a certain year the grapes grew really well or in a specific way. There are vintages, that's its own thing. There is another step up from XO, which is hors, which I'm going to put that up here again because French is not my strong suit whatsoever. But hors infers that basically it's old enough that you don't need to ask and it's going to cost a lot of money. Experts generally agree that cognac peaks at 35 years of age. After that, you can actually start to see degradation of the spirit. There are some hors cognacs that are aged all the way up to 50 years. So if you got the money to buy one of those to try it, go for it. But that's up to you. Those can get expensive. That's right up there with like the Japanese whiskeys and stuff. That is, if that's your cup of tea, go ahead and drink it. Go for it. So I haven't really talked about brandy specifically. Cognac largely covers a lot of the intricacies. Similar regulations can exist in different markets, be it American, be it wherever the grapes are grown. They can't call it cognac. So a lot of those same standards still apply. So there are also brandies that use the acronym system. It's not as common as you see it on cognac bottles, but it does exist. So similar regulations still apply to other brandies. They just can't be called cognac. There is, however, one last type of brandy I want to get into, and that's apple brandy. So apple brandy works a little differently than the rest of it, but the distilling process still looks the process itself looks similar. So whereas traditional brandy is distilled from fermented grapes, or what we know as wine, apple brandies are distilled from fermented apples. So what we would think of is probably a hard cider or maybe some sort of apple wine, depending on how you interpret it. So apple brandy, or as it was called in the old colonial era as Applejack, is actually the oldest thing distilled in what would become the United States. So a long time ago in the colonies, or maybe even prior to the colonies, I'm not sure on the exact date, they were going through this process. It worked differently. It had to do with fermenting apples and freezing the barrels, and freezing the barrel would like concentrate the alcohol, some such like that. It didn't use a traditional distilling process, but the end product was fairly similar. So it does have its roots. Granted, it was vastly overtaken by rum and then whiskey in the old colonial era. In the end though, apple brandy does taste pretty similar to the rest of the brandy lineup. It's not as dark. If you can see it, it's like this one, for example, is pretty light. There are other fruit brandies produced all around the world. It could be an apricot brandy, it could be a peach brandy, anything. And they take on subtle flavor. You're not going to get a whiff of it or get a taste or a whiff of this and think, oh, that smells like an apple orchard. You ain't going to think that, much like apricot brandy. You're not going to get a ton of apricot in it, but it does have subtle key differences to the grape-based brandies that dominate the rest of the market. I don't know if you've been counting or not, but I originally said that it was going to cover the 5 big families of spirits and then add on some others. Brandy was actually 6, and the reason I'm saying that, even though you probably have heard of brandy, is because brandy is largely misunderstood, especially by young people. Like, I really misunderstood it until I did some serious research on it. You might not have as much experience drinking it. Also, brandy just doesn't go in as many drinks. So probably the most famous that it goes in is Brandy Alexander or Brandy Crusta. There are a few that call for it, but they're quite a few of them are old-timey drinks that you wouldn't see in a whole lot of bars, but they are out there, and some are very delicious too. Carrying on though, I'm going to cover a couple spirits that you probably haven't heard of. If you have, that's awesome. You probably have a little bit of cultural exposure to it, or you just pulled up a list of random spirits, or you're just pretty in the know about this and you probably haven't learned anything this whole time, so sorry if you made it this far. The first one I'm going to talk about though is Cachaça, and I'm going to put the spelling up right here. So it might be a name you're unfamiliar with, but if you are from Brazil, have been to Brazil, or are familiar with Brazilian culture, you've definitely heard of it. So Cachaça is the national spirit of Brazil. It also goes in its national drink, which is the caipirinha. It's a cousin to rum, but it is its own spirit unto itself. So whereas rum is distilled from molasses, the sugars have already been broken down from the sugar cane, Cachaça is distilled directly from sugar cane. So it carries a different flavor to it, the sugars are broken down a different way, and it does generate a unique spirit unto its own. I'm gonna go ahead and pop up my bottle right here. I really don't, my Portuguese pronunciation is not any better than my French, so I'm not even gonna try and start pronouncing names or anything, but that's a bottle of clear cachaça. So cachaça comes in two varieties. It comes in a light and a dark. The light is more common. That's kind of in line with tequila, where most drinks call for the light. Most people are drinking the light, and the darker it gets typically is associated with the more expensive. So some dark cachaças are aged for a couple months or up to a couple years, and those again are the ones you'd probably sip neat or on ice or save for special occasions, whereas the light stuff or the clear is what you would be mixing in with your drinks. So I don't know a ton of drinks off the top of my head aside from the caipirinha, but if you're kind of exploring, like I said, it's not the same as rum, it does not taste the same as rum, but it has a similar flavor profile to rum. So if you want to kind of switch up your drinks, if you want to try a new ingredient, that would be a good way to explore, and it would be an interesting kind of party tidbit if you are putting that in a drink instead of rum and your guest asks why it tastes a little different, maybe even a little better. So second of the last three I'm talking about now is Pisco. So Pisco is another one you may not have heard of, but if you're familiar with the culture, you probably have. Pisco originates from either Peru or Chile. It's hotly contested where it actually originates. So it has an appellation of origin, and it has to come from one of those two countries. So they're still arguing about that now as to who actually created it, who should have the appellation of origin, but the two countries make up the entire supply of Pisco. So it's not terribly hard to find in the US. If you're going to like a supermarket, you might not find it, but a nicer liquor store you'll find it. So I'm popping up a brand here that's fairly common in the States. There are a number of others. Peru puts out the majority of the export Pisco. If you're buying it in the US, there's pretty good odds you're drinking Peruvian Pisco. And there is something unique about Peruvian Pisco in that it is bottled directly from the barrel. It's not diluted, so there are some that can be pretty high proof, whereas if you can get your hands on a bottle of Chilean Pisco, some of those are diluted before hitting the barrel, before hitting the bottle, and might be a little bit easier on the palate when you first get them. Now, Pisco is a relative of brandy, as Cachaça is a relative of rum, and that being because Pisco is produced from grapes that are grown in the Andes Mountains or the regions in the foothills there. Now, whereas traditional brandy, after it comes out of the still, goes into an oak barrel to age, picks up that dark color and picks up some different flavors, Pisco is put directly into the bottle, or it will go through an aging process in glass or stainless steel. So when I said earlier that Peruvian Pisco comes straight from the barrel, really what I mean is it comes straight from whatever stainless steel or glass cask it's being stored in. They age it for about 3 months. That starts to break down the alcohol a little bit, makes it a bit more palatable, and then it is put directly in the bottle. What that does is it maintains a clear, if not almost clear, appearance, and it has some different flavors to brandy. So while it is related, they're going to have different notes. The brandy's going to pick up the vanilla, the spices, the caramel colors from the barrel. You're not going to get that in Pisco, so it carries a considerable different flavor to it. Pisco goes in a number of different drinks. It is a little more known on the cocktail scene than Cachaça, the two most famous being either a Pisco Punch, which I believe was actually developed in San Francisco, and a Pisco Sour. So a Pisco Sour being related to like the whiskey sour family, And that's a great one if you see a bar has Pisco, to go ahead and order to get your hands on one to actually try it without needing to buy a bottle on your own. And the final spirit I'm going to talk about today is Grappa. And before I get into this, I just want to say, I know I did not include every spirit on here. I kind of put that disclaimer out in the beginning. There are far too many to cover, and there are a number that I would love to put on this list, but I don't want to extend the video that long for the sake of you getting brain numb and ever being able to upload it once I finally finish it. So with that, on to Grappa. Now, Grappa doesn't go in a ton of cocktails. I want to say that right now. It goes in a specific few, and the reason being is because it's related a little more so to wine. It doesn't necessarily carry a wine flavor, but it's often served in fairly similar ways. So Grappa is the national spirit of Italy, a title it shares with limoncello, actually, which is the liqueur I'll talk about on a different day. Grappa is produced in a similar fashion to brandy, with one big exception. Brandy is produced from wine, so it's produced from the liquid components of the grapes, whereas Grappa is a pumice brandy, meaning that the wine skins, the stems, everything, the seeds, everything left over after it's been pressed is then distilled, and that's how you get Grappa out of it. So I have to be very careful not to burn any of that. It goes through a very specific steaming process to slowly heat the still without exposing it to an exposed flame so they don't burn anything. So it yields something with a very different character than brandy, albeit coming from a similar product. The other aspect is brandy's fermented first into wine, whereas the pumice brandy, Grappa, is not. It's distilled directly from grape components. Now, as I said, it's traditionally served in, not necessarily in a wine glass, but it's consumed in a fairly similar fashion to wine. You don't drink that much of it. It's far more potent than wine, but it's kind of seen as a before dinner, after dinner, like an aperitivo or a digestif, more kind of a classic style of drinking that Italy and France really kicked off, but like in the 1800s. So Grappa doesn't make a huge scene in the US, but it is something good to know, especially if you're going to be in Italy. You might see it, or if you do want to experiment with it, because it does have a different character than most any other spirit. So if you want to come up with your own cocktail that utilizes Grappa, go for it, and then proliferate it. And that can be your thing for guests. If you want to take it professional, do whatever. That's up to you, and I'm going to leave that with you. All right, so that's the run through of liquor. The run through of spirits, I should say. Now, what you see here and what I've popped up, those are only a few brands of only a few spirits. I've tried to cover a lot of the biggest ones, a lot of the most common ones through the world of cocktails. So now it's up to you to go out and explore that, try and expand your palate, see what spirits you can drop into drinks you already love, or try and drop a spirit you like into a cocktail you don't already, and maybe that'll be the golden ticket. So please feel free to leave your comments. I appreciate a subscription so you can see the rest of what I'm doing on this channel. Like I said, I'm going to be doing that distillation, how liquor is made video. That should clear up a lot of those answers you have, a lot of those questions you have. So stay tuned for that. With no further ado, I'm Vic Vinegar. This is the Home Bar Beginner, and stay tuned.